and welcome to OST Talk, soundtrack discussion for fans by fans. I'm your host John, and today we'll be looking at the 1995 standalone Breath of Fire 2 soundtrack. Those familiar with video game music and video game soundtracks might be caught a little off guard that I make this my first selection for review, but as we delve into what it offers, I think others will see why I've chosen it over more prominent and popular soundtracks. That said, let's take a look at the music of Breath of Fire 2. Catching lightning in a bottle. Regardless of one's age or generation of birth, we selfishly wish for this ability. It's not that we want to harness actual lightning, but rather memories and experiences. When it comes to my own personal collection of reflections related to this phrase, I'm often reminded of 1994 Super Metroid. Given that Metroid was, and remains my favorite Nintendo property, despite some of its most recent failings, it's probably no surprise that I hold the third game in the franchise in high regard. This stance is far from shocking, but my love of Super Metroid has always come with one small caveat. Yes, the game's fantastic and deserves a playthrough every now and then, but like countless others, I've come to the realization that I'll never be able to re-experience the emotions I had during my first playthrough. Such a situation brings us to the curious phenomena that seems to be single-handedly driving up the cost of old-school video games. Being in my mid-30s, what is it with my generation's desire, a desire that's sadly become a need, to relive the past? Despite the fact that my mind tells me that my childhood was long ago, when this state of affairs is looked at from an outside standpoint, nothing could be further from the truth. Given that decade or two, are people my age really trying to recapture our youth that badly? Because if we are, we've skipped ahead, missed a few steps, and are having our midlife crisis a bit too early. Of course, I'm jesting with the above, but only partially. While there's generally a wisdom that comes with age, I'm not immune to looking back to the times when things were new to me, and some of the rosiest memories I have is when I first discovered the JRPG. I stumbled onto the scene late and joined the party with many other people when Final Fantasy VII was released in 1997, yet I didn't travel forward with the newest games right away. I did play the original Wild Arms after completing Final Fantasy VII, but I also went back and played older games like Final Fantasy VI because my friends owned them. The genre was so new and refreshing that going back technologically didn't hurt older experiences. It's because of this that games like Breath of Fire 2 were able to work their way into my rotation. Being one of the first role-playing games I ever played, I honestly can't remember if I played Breath of Fire 2 or Breath of Fire 3 first. This may seem inconsequential in the scheme of things, but in hindsight, it had to be Breath of Fire 2, because its impact would have been drastically reduced if the opposite held true. Hell, I remember renting the game cartridge week after week from a nearby video store until I beat it, so another renter couldn't erase my save data. There were so many reasons Breath of Fire 2 became such an important title for me, but one of my most cherished memories centers around the dialogue of a no-name NPC who utters the phrase, "Saint Eva will punish you." I'm at a loss as to what my character's party did to elicit that response, but even now, that line of dialogue seems brilliant to me. Naturally, as I read into that piece of dialogue, given the game's story, which may have been more controversial at the time had the internet and gaming been more widespread, people can probably glean a few things about me, but the themes that Breath of Fire 2 explored were not uncommon to games in and from Japan. Over the years, I've come to personally know Breath of Fire 2 as the poor man's Final Fantasy VI. Now, such a nickname isn't very nice or proper, and is solely based on the idea that Final Fantasy was more popular than Breath of Fire, because when you look at Final Fantasy VI beyond its storytelling, setting, and soundtrack, it's a bloody mess. However, over time, I started to notice the parallels between the two games, and the obvious one that most people seem to gloss over is that both are very character-driven. There are a lot of character-building scenarios, and they form the foundation of both games. One of the key reasons Breath of Fire 2 doesn't get as much credit in this department as Final Fantasy VI does is Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu gave each character their own unique theme, whereas Breath of Fire 2 opts out of this idea. Granted, you can kind of fudge the idea of character themes and make a case that they do exist in Breath of Fire 2, but it's a matter of personal interpretation. Another element of Breath of Fire 2 that's still ingrained in my brain is just how grindy the original SNES game was. You had to fight like crazy to build up Mass Reserves of Golden experience, which I didn't mind at the time, but would now. Thankfully, when the game was released on the Game Boy Advance in 2002, Capcom saw fit to adjust the numbers to make the game much brisker. Even though I grew up playing the SNES original, this change makes the game much more enjoyable, and I would suggest that new players opt for the Game Boy Advance rendition because of this, other improvements, and lower cost to own. The only unfortunate thing about the 2002 port is the lack of a new translation. Being one of the most infamous elements of the game, I don't know if you can call Breath of Fire 2 translation bad, but the game's script obviously suffered during its translation. A missed opportunity by Capcom for sure. I do feel that the port's sound programming does make up for it, as the game contains some of the best sound I'm aware of on the Game Boy Advance. Most of the time when a Super Nintendo game got ported to the Nintendo GBA, the crisp SNES synth would sound like it went through a cheese grater, yet Breath of Fire 2 beats the odds in this respect. In all honesty, I would like to hug the person behind this effort because it sounds excellent. There's some obvious differences in the instruments, but it sounds superior to many other games. The Breath of Fire 2 soundtrack was composed by Yuko Takehara. Fans of other Capcom games might be familiar with her work from Mega Man 6, Mega Man 7, Mega Man 10, Mega Man X, and Star Gladiator. This one-disc album from Sony Records more or less contains about half the music from the game. While there's ample room on the disc to include more songs, it's believed that this was an artistic choice to cut down the track listing to what we have here. Most game music enthusiasts know this can be a good or a bad thing depending on how it's handled, and in this case, the results are mixed, but more positive than negative. A significant portion of the omissions were for the best and, for the most part, allow the album to flow from track to track better. The omissions wouldn't be addressed until 2006 with the release of the Breath of Fire Original Soundtrack Special Box, which contains a more complete rendition of the score. I'll be bringing up some of the missing tracks as we talk about the music below, as they provide some interesting points and counterpoints to the pieces that made the cut, but at the same time, I don't want to make them the main focus. That said, the omissions may make or break the album for potential buyers, along with the fact that the rendition included on the original soundtrack special box has a higher recording volume and longer fade-outs. Musically, the Breath of Fire 2 soundtrack continues the regal sound that was cultivated by its predecessor. For the most part, I find this game's synth quality to be more inviting than the originals, which is a positive, as I thought the music of the first game could be a little off-putting with its bombast and intensity. As those listening would expect, I will do my best to take off the nostalgia goggles while dissecting the tracks below. It's been a long time since I last tried, and utterly failed, to write about Yuko Takehara's work on Breath of Fire 2, but I feel I can be honest about this one despite my attachment to the game. Blunt as the decree sounds, when you talk about the music of Breath of Fire 2, it's almost an obligation to start with town themes. Those that haven't played the game might be a little lost as to why, but those that have probably understand given the pivotal role towns, well, one particular town, plays in the game's story. I'd flesh out the reason as to why, but it's a pretty big spoiler. A section of the soundtrack that's fair at its best and competent at its worst. All sorts of small and inconvenient conflicts reign over the proceedings. However, the first conflict is merely just a matter of placement, not composition. Am I the only one who thinks having a town theme coming up to the plate as early as track 2 is off-putting? There are other issues with My Home Sweet Home that are smaller in stature, but having this one play so early exacerbates those problems. As those listening would expect, this is caused by the omission of key tracks and is rectified rather well on the Breath of Fire Original Soundtrack Special Box. It's also worth noting that My Home Sweet Home is awfully familiar to opening one from Mega Man 7, another game that Takehara composed for. This connection hasn't been confirmed, full credits for Mega Man 7 are unknown, but the track being alluded to in that game doesn't help my trepidation that it's overused in this game. This is alarming because we're still only talking about the first out of 5 town themes on this album. I know I should enjoy it more than I do, but deep down I don't. It's like there's a little bit of laziness stuck down in there deep between the notes, and it just makes me feel apathetic towards it as a whole. Unfortunately, things get worse before they get better. Like 2 miserable peas in a pod, Kingdom and Century of the Patriarch have no discernible hook and force the listener to search for some sense of connection. When I boot up a role-playing game score, one of the first things I want to do is fall in love with the town themes, and I can't really do that here. In the most basic sense, these pieces allow the listener to envision the aspects of a populated area, yet don't live beyond doing that. They're crude, straight-edged ideas. Yes, they have the regal flavor their in-game context demands of them, but I can't shake the feeling they're designed to be as ruthlessly efficient as possible. Any and all flourishes they're included with feel so essential they come off as unimaginative. Some listeners may feel this is the case with Fly Pudding, which tends to be one of the more celebrated pieces on the soundtrack, yet it pulls ahead of the aforementioned tracks with ease. In all honesty, it's not hard to see the allure of this composition, as the classical influence lends itself well to the chapter of the game it plays in. However, I can't help but come down a little on this one as well. The issue here is the instruments become a little grating as the game bats you over the head with it for a small, yet concentrated period of time. I have no qualms in saying its construction is top-notch, yet it would be a lot more agreeable to me with a set of instruments that were a little more subdued and nuanced. One of the more confusing tracks on the album has to be Crooked Ladder. Until I revisited the game after picking up a copy of the Game Boy Advance cart, I was under the false impression from my hazy memories that this was another world map theme. Not quite. The track's motif really lends itself as something that would play on the world map, but it's another town theme. Incidentally, the location where this plays is inaccessible at the outside of the player's adventure, is visited about 2 hours from the end of the game, on your way to the end of the game, so it's understandable why I forgot its context. Generally, the flashbacks this track accompanies make the track more viable than its usage as the town theme, but it being used so late in the game hurts it to a surprising degree. Last, there's Coliseum, which, if you've ever had to venture into a Coliseum in a role-playing game, you've heard this track before. One of the biggest cliches in the genre, I get the allure of the setting given these RPGs are based on the pen and paper Dungeons & Dragons games. That said, I don't dislike the setting as much as its overuse and basic structure of these tracks would imply. The events that take place in Breath of Fire 2's Coliseum are among some of the best moments in the game, and it benefits this track greatly. It's just kind of unfortunate that this makes this piece one of the stronger town themes, since it foreshadows problems in later areas. Speaking of problems, Breath of Fire 2's selection of dungeon themes does it no favors. For the most part, these tracks leave me frigid. You just have to laugh at There's Something Here, which was hilariously mistranslated as Something's Frozen in the past, because it's iconic for all the wrong reasons. Employed in an irritatingly high amount of dungeons, the track drones on and on, being antagonistic and draining as hell, and is without a doubt one of the worst pieces in the entire score. Dungeon themes should be interesting, inspire discovery, cultivate mystery, and yes, maybe even tease the listener. There's Something Here is of the teaser variety, but it doesn't know how to straddle that crucial line of being tasteful. There has to be an unwritten rule that you can't have an airy theme that's a musical manifestation of insomnia. This track thinks it's interesting when it's anything but. It's like the vacuum of space, cold and devoid of emotion. It's a never-ending workday. It haunts you, it detests you, and it wants to consume you. It's the black hole to end all black holes. Seriously, it's gotta be against the Geneva Convention to put this on infinite loop. Worst of all, it makes you brace your ears every time you enter a dungeon, which is just a horrible scenario for any video game to bow to. Enforcing its awfulness even more is just how early it crops up in the track listing, derailing the beginning of the soundtrack to an even larger degree. Now that we've gone over why there needs to be a "Don't Operate Heavy Machinery When Listening" sticker on the cover warning people about track number 4, we can move on to a track that has strikingly similar assets yet contains a little more merit. When compared on paper to its troubled predecessor, Nightmare doesn't seem to hold any new cards, but once you experience it in context you'll realize it does. Being the theme for the hellhole that's Breath of Fire 2's final dungeon, Takehara unintentionally gives perfect light to the dungeon that throws the most annoying things in your way for the sake of throwing them in. Dead ends? Check. Insane, maze-like layouts that are there solely to confuse you and make you deal with the game's insanely high encounter rate even more? Yep. While There's Something Here is pretty much there to deprive you of sleep when you reflect back on it subconsciously, Nightmare seems to be there to rob you of your sanity. Again, it loses a lot of impact out of context, yet, because it's not slathered across the entire game, it's much more tolerable. Before we get to the track that saves Breath of Fire 2's dungeon themes from being a complete disappointment, that unfortunately comes packaged with its own deadening drawback, we have to deal with another formulaic piece whose value changes depending on how it's used. When heard outside of the game or when used as a dungeon theme, Sandy Slumber will probably be called out for the transparent and soulless Arabian-style slice of pie it is, like Breath of Fire Sand Pals was. However, when the track's used as a theme and correlates to the cast of shamans, female magic users used to perform fusions, it validates its direction because of their visual design. This aside, not even this slow uptick in dungeon themes foreshadows the grace that is Wanderer. Being the only dungeon theme capable of thawing my icy heart, Wanderer perfectly encapsulates the telltale scene of a sun setting on a mountainside. Yes, the picture it paints unfortunately limits its usage, but when you hear it, those limitations don't mean a thing. This is what makes the following so hard to say. I could praise this track all day long, but I only mention it to explain how damaging its omission to the soundtrack is. you can only obtain Wonder on the original soundtrack special box, and with that laid bare, this section of this soundtrack on this specific release ends with the resounding thud. Thankfully, as arduous as the last subsection of this release is, we're about to enter greener pastures. I know it's only one man's opinion, but battle themes are an area where Takehara truly excels. Easily being one of the biggest draws of the soundtrack, those that love classic Capcom rock are in for a treat here. Cross Counter is the game's first battle theme, which is replaced by Dying Corpse at the game's halfway point. The original Breath of Fire employed the exact same strategy, and it's brilliant. A concept that was simple and ahead of its time, and should have been emulated by other games and developers, this allows these excellent rockers to have some breathing room in the confines of the game. Getting sick of Cross Counter? Don't worry, the game is going to switch you over to Dying Corpse later on. On an interesting side note, there's a little bit of history about Dying Corpse that was buried when it came time to put the music on disc. There are a few faster paced renditions of it that played during a timed event. I'm not entirely sure if those are hard-coded into the game or if the game just plays the original sequence faster. The SPC set hints at the former being true, but the faster renditions aren't included on any disc-based version of the soundtrack. Takehara follows up two great battle themes with the excellent I'll Do It. Used for common boss battles, I'll Do It will get you pumped for battle, eager to pulverize those antagonizing bosses. However, depending on the source of the audio, in-game versus soundtrack, some might feel the short duration of this piece to be a problem. In the confines of the game, where it can pleasantly loop until it needs to draw to a close, there's no issue. Yet outside the game, the piece barely makes the 1 minute mark, even with the double loop, and it doesn't feel like enough. While I wouldn't want to change the track from its original incarnation, it's in good company with other too short for their own good tracks like Mega Man X2's X-Hunter Stage 1 and Metroid Prime's Phase on Mines. Last but not least, there's Lethal Dose, the music for the game's final confrontation. Appropriately moody given the circumstances surrounding the player prior to the outside of the battle, it's obviously not cut from the same mold as the previous three themes, and it shouldn't be. Back in more hit and miss territory are the overworld themes. The most story-driven of these themes, Where Rangers, is the best of the bunch. Unfortunately, it's employed first and is eventually replaced by Our Journey when the objective of the player's quest changes. It's not that I dislike Our Journey altogether, but it's another one of those tracks that feels overused when it's not. It's kind of a silly nitpick to have considering you're going to hear the overworld theme a significant amount in any given role-playing game. Yet what amplifies this feeling is this track is based on the Breath of Fire theme that was coined by Mari Yamaguchi in the original game. While I've never been overly fond of this composition, and wasn't upset that Breath of Fire 3 featured a unique theme of its own, I can see the importance of linking the first two games together musically, especially when they're on the same console and their soundtracks are built around the same overarching sound. The second type of world map theme focuses on forms of transportation. First, there's a whale, La La La, which is connected to a later scene theme, and then there's White Wings that crops up a little later. If anything, the track titles will give those unfamiliar with the game an idea of what the game's two vehicles entail, but as far as what they offer musically, I can generally round out what I think about both in one shot. While not as bad as some of the town themes, I can't help but believe these creations meander on with no real sense of purpose. This being the case, they remind me of the vehicle themes for Wild Arms 2. The first two transportation influence themes in that game fall into the exact same category and, as you'd expect, their meandering nature is no accident. On the surface level, this may appear to be a fruitful alley to explore because when a player acquires a new mode of transportation in a role-playing game, they're likely to poke around the world map looking for things to explore. That said, when it comes to Breath of Fire 2, Takehara seems to have missed the idea that both vehicles are organic creatures with actual backstories, not inorganic nuts and bolts. I guess there's a part of me that wants these numbers to be more focused and personal because of this. Maybe have them be a little more upbeat. I don't necessarily need something that's as upbeat as Final Fantasy VIII's Ride On, as that wouldn't fit within the scope of the score, but maybe have something that feels a little bit more engaging. My qualms aside, it's interesting how similar these two tracks are when they're also leagues apart. White Wings is kinda twangy, like Fly Pudding was, while A Whale, La La La, is one of the smoothest sounding tracks on the soundtrack. At the center of the Breath of Fire 2 soundtrack lies the themes used for scenes and events. What's strange about this is, despite it being the center, it's been mined hollow on this release. This section was the hardest hit when it comes to omissions, yet was the wisest area to subtract from. Like dungeon themes, this is another conflicted area, but oddly enough it's not due to the compositional infractions. As any role-playing game music fan will tell you, Scene themes should carry pivotal memories of the game even after the game is shut off. The thing is, Breath of Fire 2's scene themes don't live beyond the game. Oh, I remember scenes from the game all these years after the fact, but I'll be damned if I could tell you what track was playing. Even the most important scene theme, the emotional, left unspoken, is left in neutral outside of its original context. I can't help but feel these themes not holding their ground indicates the game is more important to me for what it represents symbolically than its tangible underlying merits. As stated in the opening paragraph of this review, I first played Breath of Fire 2 when the genre was new and exciting to me. This freshness allowed games like this and Wild Arms to let my imagination run wild despite their faults. As much as I hate to admit it, Breath of Fire 2, game and score, aren't as good as my love for them might indicate. The game was merely the beneficiary of being there at the right time. If I had played Breath of Fire 2 at a later point in time, we wouldn't be having this discussion and I surely wouldn't have given the soundtrack a second look. The remaining scene themes, like Memories, don't fare much better in my case, although God of Decadence is one of those unique tracks I mentioned earlier that kind of crosses over into character theme territory, only this time it's depicting an adversary. Let Me Sleep So I May Dream links back to the world map theme, a whale, la la la, although in the scheme of things, I'm a little puzzled by its inclusion given it's a specific piece for a rather specific scene. The final 4 pieces on the soundtrack focus on the game's closing scenes. Not all the ending pieces appear, and the key piece used for the good ending is omitted, so these selections generally replicate what you'll hear if you get the game's bad/sad ending. Breath of Fire is a reprise and main rendition of the theme first heard in our journey, and last but not least we have Thank You Everyone, which is used for the ending montage all role-playing games are obligated to have. Personally, I've always found the game's ending montage to be one of the most curious aspects of Breath of Fire 2, as I've always been more impressed with it graphically than musically. In wrapping up what Breath of Fire 2 offers musically, I have to admit this is not Yuko Takehara's best work. As I said elsewhere prior to writing this, the score has a difficult time keeping up with its contemporaries in the genre, and it unequivocally shows. Still, despite the countless flaws we've explored, Breath of Fire 2's soundtrack should be at the forefront of any discussion when the topic turns to Yuko Takehara. Again, I'm fond of the score because of the memories attached to it, rather than the quality of its compositions. Nostalgia aside, this doesn't mean the score gets away with any of its shortcomings. People will be able to see the deficiencies of this one coming a mile away. However, this is perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of the score. Even knowing what the game means to me, Takehara's music isn't really assisted by the concept of nostalgia, which is just insanely curious given how blinding nostalgia can be. As one would expect, I can't recommend this release to just anyone, and I can't recommend it to all fans of the game. While not one of the most niche soundtracks I can think of our own, Breath of Fire 2 will only be attractive to a select few, and even those with the fondness for the game will seriously have to ponder the overall value of the purchase. Whew. Sorry about that, folks. Even I didn't realize I had that much to say about this particular soundtrack when I sat down to write about it. That said, hopefully no one thought I was being unnecessarily cruel towards it. As blunt as I was about my relationship with this one, I mean no ill will towards those holding a differing opinion. However, as I sat down to write about my experiences, the reason for my attachment became clear, and well, you can't always rosy up the truth. That said, what do you think about the Breath of Fire 2 soundtrack? Let me know down in the comments. Until next time, this is John OST Talk, signing out.